All right, so we're going to talk about writing equations in slope-intercept form today. So we're going to take your whole idea of graphing that we were looking at before your test, and now they're going to, instead of giving you the equation and asking you to graph the equation, they're going to give you information and ask you to write the actual equation. So we won't physically be drawing the line, we're going to be writing the equation. So the first thing you want to do when you're writing these equations is you want to pick out your slope. So you want to find your slope. And remember your equation for finding slope, because sometimes you might have to use the equation to find it. Is m equals y1 minus y2 all over x1 minus x2. After you find your slope, you want to find your y-intercept. And then the last thing we're going to do is plug in your slope and your y-intercept into your equation. So we're going to replace the m and we're going to replace the b in your equation so that they're actually numbers. So if we look at this first example, it says write an equation of a line with a slope of -3 and a y-intercept of 1/2. So sometimes they might be nice to you and they might just give you the information and ask you to plug it in. Sometimes we might actually have to calculate it. But so basically we know our slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b. So all we want to do is we want to replace the m with a number and we want to replace the b with a number. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to look for my slope. And they said my slope is -3, so where I had my m, I'm going to replace my m with a -3. And they said my y-intercept was 1/2, so I'm going to replace my b with a 1/2, so my final equation is just going to be y equals -3x plus 1/2. And you should still have the x and the y in your final equation. You're just substituting in for your m and your b. Not bad? So then I can also, we can make it a little more complicated. And I could give you a picture of the graph instead of just saying, here's the slope, here's the y-intercept. I can give you a picture and we can say, okay, let's look at the picture of the graph and decide what the slope is and what the y-intercept is. So we want to find our m and we want to find our b, and then we'll write our equation. So in order to find my slope, remember I want to know my rise, which in this situation is going down, and my run, my rise, and my run, so I can look at the graph and I can count it, which I see if I count I'm going down 3, so my slope is -3, and I'm going over 1, 2, 3, 4. Or I can use my slope equation and use those 2 points if I don't want to count it. So I could also, if I wanted to find my slope, I could say, okay, y1 is 2 minus y2 is negative 1 over x1 is 0 minus x2 is 4. And I could actually physically calculate it if I didn't want to count it. So I do 2 minus a negative is really plus. So 2 plus 1 is 3 over negative 4, which is exactly what we got when we counted it. So you have two options there. If they give you a graph, you can just physically count it and then write down your slope, or if it's easier for you, if you like doing the math better and picking out the 2 points and plugging it in, you can do that as well. Then we want to know what our y-intercept is. So that means I want to look on my y-axis and see where it crosses. So I see that it crosses at 2 on my y-axis. So that means my y-intercept is 2. And then once I know those two things, I'm just plugging that into my y equals mx plus b. So I see that my m is negative 3/4. So I replace my m with negative 3/4, and my b is 2. So I replace my b with 2. So your final answer is still going to have the x and the y in it. You're just replacing that m and replacing that b.
Okay, I have a question.
Okay.
Where'd you get the 2 from?
So I looked at the y-axis because I want to know where my graph crosses the y-axis, which remember is this one, right? My y-axis is up and down. So I wanted to see where I actually physically touched the y-axis, which was this point. And that point is up at 1, 2 on the y-axis. So that's why I picked 2. If my point was like up here, then I would count all the way up and say, oh, that's up at 5, and my y-intercept would be 5. So I'm always looking at my y-axis. I'm looking right along this y-axis to see where the graph passes through, and that's how I get my b.
Okay, I get it now.
That makes more sense. It'll also always be, if they just give you points, it'll be the point where your x value is 0. So then I just took the y value from that coordinate. You ready to see another example? Okay. So then I think the hardest way that they can do this is they just give you 2 points and they don't say this is the slope or this is the y-intercept or give you a graph that you can look at. They just give you 2 coordinates and they say write an equation for a line that passes through the points negative 3, 5 and 0, 1. So I think it's just easier in my brain. I like to make a picture of it so that I can see. So let's see, let's add in a graph. And I like to draw myself a picture of it so that I can get a better idea of what's going on. So I go in, I draw my x-axis, I draw my y-axis, and then I'm going to plot my points. So if I'm going to plot negative 3, 5, that means I'm going to go left 3 and up 5. So I go left 3, 1, 2, 3, up 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and plot my point. And then if I'm plotting 0, 1, I'm going over 0, up 1. So I'm plotting a point right here. And that allows me to kind of see what I'm working with. Now, if you can just look at this and you don't want to draw it, you don't have to draw it. I just like to see a picture of it because my brain just works better when I can see what I'm dealing with instead of just trying to solve the problem without seeing a picture. So now I'm going to say, okay, I want to find my slope and I would need to find my intercept. So in order for me to find my slope, I need to actually calculate it with the points that they gave me. And remember, so this is my first x value, this is my first y value, this is my second x value, my second y value. So my slope is going to be 5 minus 1 over negative 3 minus 0. So then when I do 5 minus 1, I get 4 over negative 3 minus 0 is negative 3. So my slope here is negative 4 over 3. And then I need to find my y-intercept. And the reason I really like drawing this is because I think it's easier to figure out what your y-intercept is when you look at the picture versus just looking at the coordinates. So I see that my graph crosses my y-axis right here at 1. But I could also pick that out from the point if I wanted to, because it'll always be the y value when your x value is 0. So when I look at this point that has an x value of 0, whatever the value for y is, that's my y-intercept. So you could pick it out right from the information they gave you. You don't have to draw yourself a picture, but I like the picture better than just trying to think about it. So then my last step, I'm going to plug into my y equals mx plus b, and I get y equals negative 4/3 x plus 1. Did you see that at all last year? Did they have you write equations last year? Okay. So the only thing that we're going to add differently this year is then I can ask you to also write a linear function. So with our fancy new function notation, the f of x in the parentheses, I can ask you exactly the same question as number 3. The only difference here is they said write a linear function f with the values f of 0 equals 10 and f of 6 equals 34. So they're still asking exactly the same thing they asked last time. They're just using a new, different math notation in order to do that. And what's happening here is if I look at f of 0 equals 10, that's the same thing as saying that when I plug in 0, I get out 10. So writing that is the same thing as them giving you the coordinate 0, 10. It's just that they're telling you, they're writing it in our fancy function notation so that we already know that these points make a function. Which also means that if we're looking at f of 6 equals 34, we really have the coordinate 6, 34. And then it's exactly the same question they gave us last time, where we have to find our slope, we have to find our intercept, and we're just going to plug it in. Do you want me to draw a picture, or do you want me just to solve it?
Solve it.
Just solve it? Okay. So the first thing I need to do is find my slope. So if I'm going to find my slope, my m equals, this is my x1, my y1, x2, y2. So I'm doing 10 minus 34 over 0 minus 6. 10 minus 34 gives me negative 24 over negative 6. Negative 24 divided by negative 6 is just 4. And then I've got to find my intercept. Which one is my intercept? What's the value of my intercept from those 2 points? 10. 10. Exactly, yeah. It's the y value where my x is 0. So my y-intercept is 10. Now when I go to write my function, the only difference is instead of writing y equals mx plus b, since we want to tell them that it's a linear function like they asked for, I'm going to replace my y with an f of x. Because remember, f of x is the same thing as y. It's saying the function, when we plug in x, equals mx plus b. And then I'm still just going to replace my m, and I'm going to replace my b, so that my final equation, f of x, equals, my m is 4, x, plus my b is 10. So your final linear function, instead of saying y equals, we'll say f of x equals. But still all the same steps, we're just writing it with fancier algebra notation. What do you think? Not bad? Okay, so the one thing that you will have to pay attention to when you do your homework for this, when you type in the equations, just make sure you don't put any spaces in anything, because if you put a space in somewhere, it's going to mark it wrong because the computer is super particular about the way you type in everything. So especially like when you type in f parentheses x parentheses, just make sure you're not hitting the space bar in between anything so that you don't get it marked wrong because of a silly space.